To move the motion.
Very much indeed. I beg to move that the House has considered financial support for adoptive parents, and it really is a pleasure to bring this debate today and have you in the chair, Ms Furness. Adoption is one of the most selfless acts a person or a family can undertake. It provides children with the opportunity to thrive in a permanent, loving home, often completing a family, as I have seen for myself in my role as a proud auntie. Yet, despite the immeasurable value adoption offers to these children, to their new families and society, financial barriers prevent many prospective adopters from stepping forward. And today, I wish to highlight the case of Kirsty. Kirsty's a constituent of mine from Marple, and her case exposes a significant gap in the financial support system that discourages self-employed individuals from adoption. Kirsty's a self-employed mother who dreamed of expanding her family. And after a year of trying to conceive a second child, she and her husband decided to explore adoption. Their first son, Charlie, a bright-eyed 4-year-old with an unshakable love for trains, often talked about how much he wanted a little sibling to be his assistant train driver. And for Kirsty and her family, opening their hearts and their home to a child via adoption was the best option. But just as Kirsty began to embrace this vision for her family's future, a close friend, also self-employed and in the process of adopting, she informed her that she was not entitled to the same financial support through statutory adoption pay, throwing her plans into doubt ever since. Now, unlike biological parents who qualify for maternity allowance or employed adopters who are eligible for statutory adoption pay, self-employed adopters like Kirsty fall into a financial support void. While statutory guidance allows local authorities to make discretionary means-tested payments equivalent to these allowances, such support is not guaranteed, and local authorities have no legal duty to provide it. And in fact, a Freedom of Information request by the charity Home for Good revealed that 34% of local authorities lack any policy for providing this financial support. And even worse, 90% of self-employed adopters surveyed by the APPG on adoption and permanence in 2022 reported that their social worker never advised them about these discretionary payments and the possibility of receiving them. Many of those in Kirsty's situation cannot take the financial risk of adopting a child without assured support. She is not alone. This gap creates a stark disparity between those who are employed and self-employed, a barrier for many who might otherwise give a child a stable and loving home. The consequences of this lack of support are far-reaching. Having often faced abuse or neglect, adopted children need time and care to settle into their new families. As a result, adoptive parents are often advised to take up to a year off work to ensure proper bonding and support. So where does this leave those who are self-employed? Without financial support, they face impossible choices, continuing to work and sacrificing the vital time they need to build a relationship with their child, sacrificing their careers and their financial stability, or abandoning their adoption plans altogether. And for many, the only realistic option is the latter. The government of different shades has often recognised the importance of building a relationship with an adopted child, but for too long has insisted that self-employed adopters should have to rely on unreliable discretionary payments. And in November, I asked the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions to extend statutory adoption pay to the self-employed, or to introduce an equivalent benefit. And while the Minister's response expressed support for adoptive parents, yet again it pointed to a flawed system of discretionary payments. In December, I called on the government to allocate time to debate how we can get and support people like Kirsty, and do that in government time, sadly so far to no avail. And just before Christmas, I submitted an amendment to the Employment Rights Bill, new clause 46, which would allow the self-employed to claim statutory adoption pay. Last week, in a letter to me, the Minister committed, not this Minister, a different Minister, committed again to reviewing the parental leave system, agreeing that improvements needed to be made. And as this review begins, I must urge departments across government to prioritise financial support for self-employed adopters. The financial case for supporting adoptive parents is compelling. Research by the Consortium of Voluntary Adoption Agencies UK shows that in 2021, adoption saved the UK economy £4.2 billion through improvements in children's health and education and employment prospects compared to the outcomes for children that remained in care or other placements. Local councils saved £3.6 billion, while the NHS and wider economy benefited by £341 million and £34 million, respectively. The CVAA has also found that at least £1.3 million worth of value is created when a child is adopted, underscoring the societal and economic benefits of increasing adoption numbers. Yet the number of adoptions has halved since a peak in 2015, even as the number of looked-after children has risen by 25%. Removing financial barriers and empowering those who are self-employed through guaranteed financial support to step forward for adoption could reverse this troubling trend. The case for further financial support for adoptive parents in addressing the distinct challenges they face is equally compelling. Rates of depression and anxiety rise to as high as 32% among those who adopt. Unlike biological parents, adoptive parents often have to contend with navigating their child's complex trauma, attachment issues, and a long and arduous adoption process. These challenges can be compounded by the grief and loss many adoptive parents can feel if they have experienced infertility or failed attempts to conceive. Adoption can also place strain on relationships, and while divorce rates among adoptive parents are not disproportionate, the difficulties of parenting children with complex needs, alongside the emotional toll of the adoption process, can push couples to their limits. Financial instability worsens these challenges, threatening the family cohesion of those brave and selfless enough to adopt. And finally, the adoption process in the UK is long and complex, sometimes taking years from the initial application to the final court approval. Prospective parents are subject to background checks, references, intense assessment and adoption panel scrutiny before they are even able to find a match. This journey, though of course it's necessary to ensure the best outcomes for children, the journey places immense stress on prospective adopters. So I urge the Minister and the various departments involved in this work to explore ways to provide financial support that acknowledges and mitigates these unique pressures placed on adoptive parents, self-employed or otherwise. And I hope that this will play a significant part in the upcoming review into parental leave. Adoptive parents deserve robust financial support, and addressing this issue is not only a matter of fairness, but also a means of unlocking the full potential of adoption. Ministers across government and the various departments involved have the opportunity to lead the way by extending statutory adoption pay to self-employed adopters or implementing an equivalent benefit. We should not allow financial barriers to stand in the way of creating loving families and providing children with the stability they so desperately need and undoubtedly deserve. The government could and should act decisively, ensuring that adoption remains a viable and supported choice for all prospective parents. Thank you.
The question is that this House has considered the matter of financial support for adoptive parents. Robin Swan.
Thank you very much, Ms Furness, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship in regards to this. And can I thank the member for bringing what is a very important topic, I believe, to the attention of this House, because I believe it's important that we engage with adoptive parents and prospective adoptive parents and actually hear their experiences from adopting a child, because it's only through that listening can we know the real life challenges that they face. And I think the prime example that the member has raised in her opening comments in regards to those financial pressures that are actually deterring couples and individuals coming forward to actually adopt children. Ms Furness, I was Minister in Northern Ireland, and I actually put through the Adoption and Children's Act in 2022. Until that point, Northern Ireland had been bound by a wholly inadequate and outdated legislation that hadn't been actually updated for 3 decades, so actually predated devolution at that point in time. So while that legislation actually updated the broader adoption frameworks, it also included some tangible benefits, such as the introduction of a legal duty, so that our adopters in Northern Ireland can now access more support through our social services. But I think the issue being raised here today is actually one step, and only one step, that the UK Government could take that would actually bring immediate action to improve the support for some of our adoptive parents, and actually broadening that statutory adoption leave and pay to those self-employed parents in the same way that the maternity allowance is available for self-employed parents. Ms Furness, why I believe that this is important. Currently, in the last statistics that's shown in Northern Ireland, as of the 31st of March 2024, we had 3,999 children and young people in care in Northern Ireland, the highest number recorded since the introduction of the Children's Northern Ireland Act in 1995. Some 28% of those children in care have been looked after for less than a year, but 29% have been looked after for more than 5 years. So I believe anything that we can do to increase the number of people who want to come over and actually adopt children and take them out of our care systems and give them that loving, caring home that is often experienced by those who come out of care into adoption. Last year alone, only 97 children were adopted from care in Northern Ireland. 48% of those were actually adopted by couples in their 40s. So I believe that this step actually could encourage a wider spectrum of people to come forward. Those people who, and I'm not saying in a derogatory way, but those couples in their 40s who are maybe more financially secure at that point in their life, who see that as the point that they can adopt. If the supports and the government supports were there, that can actually allow younger couples, those self-employed and those working from home even at this stage as well, could actually come forward and take up that I think gift that is the ability to adopt a child out of care. And that's why I would encourage the government to do all that they can to support the issue that has been brought to this House today.
Steve Darling.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairwomanship. And I'd like to start by congratulating my colleague from Hazel Grove for obtaining this really important debate in Westminster Hall. I'd also like to highlight to the Minister the Adoption Support Fund, and I'd be really grateful if he could talk around what long-term plans there are that the government may or may not have about baking that into government proposals, because at the moment it's a hand-to-mouth existence. And in the week after I got elected, there was a resident raising with me their concerns. I've already written to the Minister some months ago on this issue, but I wonder if government thoughts may have changed on this. Madam Chair, I speak as somebody who is adopted myself, and adopted into a very loving family in the 70s with Eric and Penny. Eric was self-employed. He wasn't a toolmaker. He was a lorry driver, a haulage contractor if we were perhaps trying to be social climbers. But the reality is that it was a really loving family that I was born into, and of course, as a self-employed haulage contractor, he would have benefited from the proposals that we've heard from my colleague. But the world has changed massively around adoption and fostering, and the babe in arms isn't perhaps what you often get through adoption or fostering. It is often children who have had really complex, challenging lives and will often try to test parents. I have a good friend in Torquay who believes that daddy is a monster because previous daddy was sadly a monster to him, and tests him regularly. And it is really challenging for that adopted family that they have to face that. I'd also like to welcome the comments made on Homes for Good. That's a service that I brought into Torquay when I was leader of the local authority, and that looks at driving adoption through those with faith and using churches to support those with faith. So it is a need that is very significant out there. And I would, even on purely cynical reasons, I would encourage the Minister to reflect on how it's important to support self-employed people so we enhance the pool of those. Because one only needs to look at the cost to councils up and down the country of social care where one can't find foster placements or adoption, because quite often foster does turn into adoption, and we are looking at the private sector sadly making significant profits around that world. And whilst I'm pleased that the government are making progress in those areas, the best way that the government can do that is looking to place like a place that I visited once upon a time, which is Leeds, and now Torbay is facing this way of looking to become child-friendly, UNESCO recognised, so that we drive that positive culture of engagement and support for our young people throughout the United Kingdom. And I hope the Minister will look kindly upon the proposals from my colleague from Hazel Grove. Thank you, Chair.
Mrs Furness, very good to serve under you, and my thanks to the honourable member for bringing this debate to us. And it's a very important topic, as we've acknowledged, and I'm particularly struck by how she described in the case of her constituent Kirsty the specific impact of the regime, the financial regime that adopting parents face, but also her general points, also echoed by the honourable member who just spoke, these general challenges faced by adoptive parents, both in terms of the challenges that their children continue to endure, having joined their family, but also the adopting family themselves and their own birth children. And reflecting, as honourable members spoke, I was struck by how much more we know now than we used to about the process of early development among children. And I think back to the years, about 50 years ago, when my parents adopted my sister, compared to the experience that my sister herself has had adopting her two young sons. And the difference is pretty stark. My sister simply arrived, and that was that. And the expectation was that all was now well, and no further support was required. And indeed, things did turn out very, very well, I'm glad to say, for my sister. But the support that has been offered to her as as adoptive parent is far greater and more sympathetic, and shows much greater understanding of the challenges around child development than happened a generation or two ago. And I want to just briefly pay tribute to the former government, which over the last 10 or 15 years did introduce some quite significant improvements to the system that adoptive parents face. David Cameron and Michael Gove both made a priority to ensure that the regime around adoption was improved. In fact, I've just been reading an article by, in the Spectator magazine, a leader this week, praising the performance of the last government in respect of adoption. I can't think it's anything to do with the editor of the Spectator. But Michael Gove does deserve credit, I think, for the work that was done in the introduction of adoption leave, the pupil premium and the additional pupil premium that's available for adopted children, the priority in school admissions. And then latterly, and I pay tribute to my former colleague David Johnston, the Children's Minister in the last Parliament, who introduced the Adoption Support Fund, which the Honourable Member just mentioned. And I think it's fair to ask ourselves why additional support is needed for adoptive families and for adopted children. I mean, you could argue, I think we should, that all families need support and help bringing up children. But the fact is, and as we've heard from honourable members, adoption is obviously, and one hopes, and almost always is, the destination after a long journey of disruption for a young child. And it's a wonderful thing that a settled life is now available to that child. But as we've heard, the challenge is not over when the child arrives in their new family. And we know from experience in all of our constituencies, I think, of how much adoptive families have to work to ensure that their children are properly supported. And it's worth noting that the expectation has been, and I'm afraid still somewhat applies, despite the reforms that I just mentioned, that for fostering families, support continues after the placement. And the expectation is that those children in that family are going to need ongoing support. But in the case of adoption, I think the expectation remains that rather as with a new child born into the family, they are almost exclusively now the responsibility of the adoptive parents, and that support from the outside is not so necessary. And yet it so is necessary. And we all recognise, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to add my voice to what we've heard about the enormous benefits that adoptive parents bring to our society as a whole in, frankly, rescuing many, many children who face years ahead of them of potentially neglect or abuse if they'd remained where they were, or simply of inadequate care and upbringing if they remained in the care system. And I think particularly of friends of mine who, or former colleagues of mine, 25 years ago adopted quadruplet boys in their age 2 who had been removed from a disgracefully, appallingly abusive family and placed with this family. And though it was very, very challenging for that family and for those 4 boys over the course of their childhood, they've all grown up well, they're all doing well, and their parents are rightly proud of them. And I think of the likely trajectory that those children would have been on if this family had not stepped forward to look after them. 4 boys having experienced extreme abuse in their early years. The costs they would have imposed on our society, both financial and social. And then we think of the topic that's very much in our minds at the moment, the tragedy of the grooming gangs, which, while very complex and every case being different, nevertheless had in common in many of the cases of the girls who were the victims of those crimes having been in care. And the clear obligation on us, I think, as a society, and something that the last government and this government both have asserted, is that we need to have more children leaving the care system and gaining the stability and support of a loving family. So that means more fostering, and we all need to do more, I think, to promote the opportunities of fostering and help people become foster parents. More adopting, as we've been discussing, and other ways in which we can support children to grow up in the stability of stable families. So I support all these initiatives, Foster to Adopt. Homes for Good was mentioned, a tremendous project. Also want to acknowledge the work of kinship carers, a really important part of the sort of, as it were, the economy of care, who again, thanks largely to David Johnson in the last Parliament, can get significantly more support than they did. I think we need to go further and ensure that they too can access this sort of support around statutory pay and parental leave. We need more support for everybody who is permanently supporting and permanently parenting children in their families. And as the Honourable Lady mentioned, there is clearly an anomaly for adoptive parents, particularly for self-employed parents who can't get the statutory adoption pay, who, unlike self-employed birth parents, don't get the equivalent of maternity pay. And as she said, there are opportunities for local authorities to provide discretionary support, but most people are unaware of that, and it is indeed discretionary. I'm not sure that it shouldn't be discretionary. I think there is an important debate to be had about the degrees to which we ring-fence finance and impose obligations on local authorities. But there clearly does need to be far greater awareness and encouragement, awareness among the public of the support that is available, and encouragement for local authorities to fulfil their responsibilities to adoptive parents. I think we need a better funding arrangement altogether for local government to take on board and be able to fulfil its social responsibilities. But most of all, we need to recognise how much families themselves are the essential welfare system in our society. And the more that we can do to ensure that they can provide that responsibility and fulfil the important work that they do in respect of these children who so desperately need the love of a supportive family, the better. And I acknowledge the government wants to do that, and I look forward to hearing what the Minister will do in future. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Furness. It is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship today, and may I begin by congratulating the member for Hazel Grove on securing this important debate, and I'd like to thank all who've taken part in the discussion for their thoughtful and insightful comments. As the Honourable Lady mentioned, I've recently received a written question from her about this issue, and I commend her for her continued support and campaigning in this crucial area. Becoming an adoptive parent is rewarding, of course it is, but it is without doubt challenging too. It is admirable when anybody steps up to that role, let alone those who do so whilst in work. This government does not underestimate the life-changing difference that adoptive parents up and down the country make every single day. Breaking down barriers to opportunity is one of this government's key missions for the country. That is why we are committed to doing everything we can to ensure that employed parents can balance their work and home lives. Our plan to make work pay will make sure that there is more flexibility and support for working families, and our reforms to get Britain working include transforming employment support so that people with specific barriers to work, such as parents, receive personalised help to overcome the particular hurdles that they face. This not only supports our #1 mission to drive growth in every corner of the country, it creates a cycle of opportunity. People cannot fulfil their potential if they are struggling to afford life's essentials, but good work brings security and dignity. That is why good work will always be at the foundation of our approach to tackling poverty and supporting families. Children cannot fulfil their potential if they are growing up in poverty in any familial setting, and we cannot fulfil our potential as a country if the next generation is held back. That is why we have already started the urgent work needed to get the Child Poverty Task Force up and running, and it is working to publish a comprehensive and ambitious child poverty strategy which will consider all children across the United Kingdom, whether in care, adopted or living with birth parents. It's perhaps worth reiterating at this point that maternity payments such as statutory maternity pay and maternity allowance are intended to help protect the health and well-being of women and their babies rather than assisting with the costs associated with a new child. But I appreciate that the member for Hazel Grove is specifically raising the issue of adoptive parents, and where a family welcomes a new child into their world, it is only right that they have the time to bond, a point eloquently made again by the member for Hazel Grove in her opening speech introducing the debate, and indeed by all of today's speakers. I'll just briefly turn to some of the points that were made in the debate, and it was genuinely important, I think, that we heard about Kirsty and her own experiences thinking about adopting a second child and indeed an assistant train driver. This is one of many examples that there are of people who have to make these very difficult choices. I myself have constituents in a similar position, and it is incredibly important that we hear such testimony when considering these issues. She also highlighted that there is no guarantee, as was reiterated by the opposition spokesperson, on the means-tested local authority payments, and also that many councils don't have policies for that. Before going on to suggest that, to set out that adoption saves the economy £4.2 billion a year. She, like myself, is a former senior local authority leader in Greater Manchester, deputy leader of Stockport Council, and she knows the benefits not just in terms of education and health as she set out, but in the local authority care system with the many pressures that there are there, and the fact that obviously secure permanent placements are the best thing for that child. That support is priceless, and I think we're all agreed on that today. She went on to say that new adoptive parents need to take time off to enable a child to settle in their new home, and I absolutely agree with what she is saying there because of the many and complex needs that adoptive parents may face in settling their new child in, having to balance their employment needs as self-employed or people in mainstream employment. There are obviously many issues. I agree that improvements need to be made to the parental system, and she'll bear with me, I will come to a specific promise that I want to make to her in terms of how I feel we can best move this forward. The member for South Antrim also highlighted his local government experience, and I think it's important to draw that out because we have all been corporate parents and we understand the importance of the role that both the care system plays, but also foster carers, kinship carers, as the opposition spokesperson said, and especially adoptive parents making a decision to permanently offer a home and love and support to a young person. But he did set out some of the specific challenges faced in Northern Ireland. I'm grateful to him for doing that. He's right to highlight the spiralling statistics in terms of children in care. And as I just mentioned, it is critical to anybody with local government experience that sustainability and feasibility of adoption for all is imperative. So I'm very much aware of the points that are coming out in this debate, and I thank him for his contribution. Turning to the member for Torbay, the spokesperson for the Liberal Democrats, and his specific question on the Adoption Support Fund, he is as ever, entirely right to raise this, and it's a very reasonable question because current funding, I think, is only set until April 2025. If I may, I will write to the Department for Education directly and share the response that I received from him, because I don't want to speak on behalf of another department today in case the information that I provide turns out to be inaccurate, but I will follow up with him directly on that. He also rightly set out the challenge that we face in terms of the stereotypical perception of adoption as receiving a babe in arms, but actually the fact that it is more often than not the case that people could be opening up their home and their family to children with very complex needs, children who are older, who have experienced significant trauma, and that requires time off too. It is not just the fact that it is a newborn child who requires a parent with them for obvious reasons throughout the day. It is also the fact that there can be significant complex needs there, and I absolutely acknowledge the point that he's making there that reflects the real-world circumstances that many adoptive parents face. The opposition spokesperson set out many of the advances that have been made over the past 14 years in this space, and I fully acknowledge that. It does rather beg the question how we've ended up with this position. However, I do accept that we did move forward things like, as he said, the automatic pupil premium allocation and the adoption support fund, as well as the introduction of adoption leave. I think that the challenge that we face here is how we can collectively, as he said, encourage people to come forward as adopters, as kinship carers, as foster carers, and we do obviously have a responsibility as a government to make that process as easy as possible. So I do agree with him, because when you look at the outcomes faced by children who have grown up in what one might consider traditional care settings, i.e. a children's home, versus the outcomes of children who grow up in a more traditional family unit, whether adoptive or foster carers or with birth parents, those statistics are stark. If you look at the number of care leavers in the prison system, for instance, if you look at the level of qualification, some of these figures are incredibly concerning. So that is a point that is very well made. But if I turn back to the substantive comments that I wanted to make, we do want to make sure that parental leave is supporting all working families as well as possible. So the government has committed to a review of the parental leave system. Work is already underway on planning for that review, because enabling parents to take time off work not only allows for bonding time, it ensures that they are able to give a child the care that they need. In the case of adoption, that ability, as we have just discussed, is essential to connect and care in terms of securing the permanence of any adoption placement. For all these reasons, employed adoptive parents have broadly the same rights and protections as birth parents in that statutory adoption leave is a day one right. But of course, that is the anomaly that we are speaking to today. So I want to give the Honourable Member for Hazel Grove a clear assurance that I will write in to that parental pay review parental leave review and make sure that what we have discussed today is fed into that process, because I think whatever your view on the rights and wrongs of this, we can all accept, actually, that there is a gap and that we all want as many people as possible to be able to come forward as carers, and this is potentially a barrier to that for some people, not least because we have that means-tested, not especially well advertised, not brilliant levels of uptake current system that I think we would all want to look at. So where we're at in the meantime, I think, is that where adopters don't qualify for that statutory payment, they have the local authority option. But I'd also like to highlight some of the wider support, and the opposition spokesperson did this in his contribution. Not only advice, information and counselling, but also the means-tested support. Potentially, on top of that, support for new parents, any new parents, in terms of potential eligibility for universal credit, child benefit, the Sure Start maternity grant, all of which can help all families with the cost of raising children, especially those in need of extra support. I think I will leave it there, Ms Furness, with just a final thank you again to the Honourable Member for Hazel Grove for calling this debate. We do recognise the contributions of self-employed people who are a key part of our economy, and we appreciate the valuable difference that adopters make. So it is only right that we've taken the time to consider how we support the remarkable people who take on both roles at the same time, and I'm pleased to have had the chance to do so today. I reiterate that I will write to the Department for Business and Trade about this debate, the issues that have been made and how this can feed into the review that I mentioned earlier, because it is crucial that we accept that this is an anomaly in the system. And I will obviously send her a copy of my correspondence.
Lisa Smart to wind up.
Indeed, Ms Furness, and I'm really grateful to all of those members who've taken part in this debate this afternoon. The member for South Antrim talked about his experience as a minister in Northern Ireland, and it's really good to have his support, and he's absolutely right to point at the numbers of children we're talking about in the different parts of the UK and how we enable more brilliant future parents to adopt and drive up those adoption rates. I want to say thank you to Penny and Eric, who are my honourable friend, the member of Torbay's mum and dad, who adopted him in the 70s. And he was absolutely right to talk about the Adoption Support Fund. It's something that I know is hugely valuable to many families, and future security of it, or future clarity on what's coming down the track, I think he's absolutely right to ask about that, and also the challenges, different challenges faced by adopters, and how it isn't a stereotypical babe in arms found under a bush somewhere. I think a number of members, both the opposition spokesperson and my honourable friend, the member for Torbay, talked about the role of that councils play, local councils play, and funding of local councils plays in some of the decision-making that can happen around this. When I was, the Minister rightly talked about my previous life as a member of a local authority, and it's one of the jobs that you take most seriously as a councillor, is the fact that you have that corporate parenting role and that key role to keep the most vulnerable children safe. And I think local authority finances, lots of people in this place talk about the importance of clarity and about properly funding, and indeed the opposition spokesperson talked about funding local authorities and doing that properly. I think when we're talking about some of the most important jobs of councils, we're talking about exactly this: children in care who are the most vulnerable in our society. And my honourable friend talked about the cost to councils and the cost of children waiting a very long time for their adoption to come through, and the longer they wait, the more it costs, both in terms of to them as individuals, but also to councils in terms of their ongoing care. The opposition spokesperson talked about how we know more now about the importance of, or our understanding has developed when it comes to early childhood development, and he also talked about somebody who used to work in this place who knows quite a lot about adoption issues, and he was right to do so, because this isn't, in my opinion, we can work cross-party to fix anomalies like this, and so I'm grateful for his remarks. And I think he talked about a family of 4 boys, and I think that's exactly the sort of story we need to have in our minds about the impact of a good, loving, warm, secure home for those 4 boys and how their lives may well have been very different had they not had that. So I'm very grateful to him for that, and also talking about kinship carers, which I know will come through the Children's Wellbeing and Schools Bill. There's work being done to look at that, and my party look forward to scrutinising and improving some of the bill in that regard. The Minister, I really want to welcome his comments, and particularly that he accepts it's an anomaly that we're talking about today, and especially the action that he's undertaken to carry out. It's really good that the government is committed to reviewing parental leave, and I really hope that's the mechanism through which we can correct this anomaly. We absolutely need to encourage more people into fostering, into adoption, into kinship care, and we need to remove any barriers that may stop people from being able to take up those opportunities. So I am really grateful to everybody who's taken part today. It is really good to have government support for looking at this, and I really look forward to where this goes, because we need to enable as many brilliant future parents to take up this opportunity and complete their family as we possibly can. Thank you.
The question is that this House has considered the matter of financial support for adoptive parents. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Thank you very much, everybody.